A dozen languages clash in a northern harbor, a chaos of foreign coins and exotic scents. Towering wooden ships unload their treasures, while merchants argue over the price of Russian furs and Flemish cloth. This was the sound of the Hanseatic League in action. How did a scattered alliance of merchant towns, with no king and no standing army, rise to dominate northern Europe for 4 centuries? You are about to discover the secrets of a commercial empire built not on conquered land, but on a web of trade routes, unshakable trust, and the humble timber of its mighty ships. We will uncover how this network of cities defied kings and pirates alike, and why its central archives vanished without a trace. What does it take for a simple idea to outlast the greatest empires? Long before the Hanseatic League cast its shadow, the Baltic Sea was a wild and treacherous frontier. Viking longships, laden with silver and amber, had carved out the first trade routes, but their age of raiding and trading was fading. Into this volatile space stepped the merchants of Gotland, an island in the middle of the Baltic. These Gotlanders became the essential middlemen, the brave souls who knew the secret pathways through the fog and the shifting sandbars. They established a key trading post at Visby, a place where Russian furs and wax met the fine cloth and silver of the West. Yet this system was fragile and fraught with peril. A merchant's entire fortune could be lost in an instant to a sudden storm, a pirate ambush, or the arbitrary demand of a local lord imposing a ruinous toll. There was no law on the open water, no protection beyond the strength of your own crew. It was this very climate of danger and unpredictability that made cooperation not just profitable, but essential for survival. The old ways were no longer enough. The stage was set for a revolution, and it began not with a king's decree, but with the ambitions of a single city. Lübeck, rebuilt after a fire in 1159, was perfectly positioned at the crossroads of north-south and east-west trade. Its merchants looked at the chaotic, dangerous system and saw a better way. They asked a simple, powerful question. What if we banded together? What if we could guarantee each other's safety, standardize our weights and measures, and speak with one voice to the princes and pirates who threatened our livelihoods? The desperate need for security and fair dealing created the perfect conditions for a merchant union to form, transforming competition into a collective strength that would soon reshape the map of Europe. The fire that consumed the old settlement was a disaster, but it also cleared the ground for a vision. In 1159, Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony, looked upon the smoldering ruins at the mouth of the Trave River and saw more than a tragedy. He saw a perfect opportunity. He ordered Lübeck to be rebuilt, not as a simple town, but as a purpose-built hub of commerce. Its location was its genius, a geographical masterstroke. Sitting on a narrow neck of land, it had direct access to the Baltic Sea, while its river connection led deep into the German interior. This was the ultimate crossroads, where salt from Lüneburg could meet the herring of Scandinavia, and where timber from the vast northern forests could be loaded onto ships bound for the growing cities of the West. But a prime location means nothing without order. The true spark of the Hanseatic League was not just brick and mortar. It was a revolutionary set of rules known as the Lübeck Law. This was the city's secret weapon, a legal code so effective and fair that it became the most sought-after export Lübeck would ever produce. Imagine being a merchant in a world where every town had its own confusing rules, its own arbitrary fines, and its own corrupt officials. The Lübeck Law changed all that. It established clear, predictable rules for trade, property, and dispute resolution. It created a council of merchants to govern the city, ensuring that the people who understood commerce were the ones making the decisions. This legal framework was like a universal operating system for a medieval city. Over 100 towns across northern Europe would eventually adopt it, from Tallinn in the east to Bergen in the north. When you sailed into a port governed by Lübeck law, you knew the weights and measures would be standard. You knew your contracts would be honored. You knew you would receive a fair hearing if a deal went wrong. This shared legal identity created an incredible bond of trust across vast distances, turning a collection of individual ports into a unified network. Lübeck was not just a city. It was the blueprint for an empire of trade, and its laws were the invisible architecture that held it all together. A blueprint is one thing, but a fortress in a foreign land is another. The merchants of Lubeck knew that to truly control the flow of goods, they needed a permanent foothold beyond their own harbors. Their first and most daring venture was to the east into the formidable Russian principality of Novgorod. There, on the muddy banks of the Volkhov River, they established the Peterhof. This was the first contour, a word that would come to mean a fortified trading post, a piece of Hanseatic territory planted firmly on foreign soil. Life inside the Peterhof was stark and regimented, a world apart from the bustling city that surrounded its high wooden walls. The Hanseatic merchants, or their young apprentices, lived under a rigid set of statutes designed for one purpose: to protect the League's commercial secrets. They were absolutely forbidden from fraternizing with the local Russian population. No sharing meals, no learning the language beyond what was needed for business, and most critically, no romantic entanglements. A merchant who married a local woman would lose his Hanseatic privileges forever. This was a community living in self-imposed isolation, all in the name of maintaining a monopoly. And the rewards for this harsh discipline were immense. The Peterhof became the sole gateway for Novgorod's incredible wealth. From the vast Russian forests came rivers of luxurious sable, marten, and fox furs, so highly prized in the fashionable courts of Western Europe. Endless barrels of beeswax, essential for the countless church candles of the continent, and thick, golden honey flowed through its warehouses. In exchange, the Hanseatic merchants offered fine Flemish cloth, a symbol of status and wealth, and the solid silver coins mined from the rich veins of German mountains. This was not just a simple exchange of goods, it was the birth of a system. The contour proved that a distant network of cities could project its power and protect its people far from home. The success of the Peterhof became the model, a template that would soon be replicated in Bruges, London, and Bergen, creating a chain of commercial fortresses that would bind the northern world together. While their eastern fortress in Novgorod secured a flow of furs and wax, the Hanseatic merchants set their sights on an even richer prize to the west, the Kingdom of England. There, on the north bank of the Thames River in the heart of London, they established their next great contour, a compound that would become known as the Steelyard. This was not just a trading post, it was a stunningly powerful state within a state. Through shrewd negotiation and sheer economic importance, the Hanseatic League secured a series of royal charters from the English crown that granted them privileges almost unthinkable for foreign merchants. They were given a permanent, walled enclave with its own warehouses, counting houses, and even a dedicated wharf. Most importantly, they were granted sweeping tax exemptions, allowing them to import and export goods while paying only a fraction of the customs duties that burdened their English competitors. This made their goods cheaper and their position in the London market virtually unassailable. So what did they trade to earn such favor? The lifeblood of the medieval English economy was wool, and later, high-quality woven cloth. The Hanseatic merchants became the primary exporters of these English textiles, shipping them to the continent where demand was insatiable. In return, their ships unloaded at the Steelyard wharf the essential materials England lacked. From the vast forests of Scandinavia and northern Germany came the timber and tar needed to build the English navy and merchant fleet. From the metalworking centers of Germany came high-grade steel, weaponry, and brassware. And perhaps most cherished of all were the barrels of Rhenish wine, a luxury import from the German Rhineland that flowed into the cellars of English nobility and royalty. The Hanseatic League had made itself indispensable. By controlling the flow of these critical goods, they wove themselves so deeply into the fabric of English commerce and courtly life that challenging their power meant risking economic turmoil. The success of the Steelyard proved the League's model could work anywhere, turning the might of a kingdom into a mere link in its ever-expanding commercial chain. But the League's ambitions stretched far beyond the great capitals of London and Novgorod. They sailed further north, into the deep, glacier-carved fjords of Norway, to a city whose wealth was not measured in silver or fine cloth, but in the wind-dried flesh of a humble fish. Bergen became the third great pillar of the Hanseatic Empire, and its contour was the epicenter of a trade in what was known as Northern Gold. This was stockfish, cod caught in the frigid Arctic waters and dried on wooden racks by the relentless North Sea wind until it was hard as a board. Walking through the brigand district of Bergen was like stepping into a world built by and for commerce. A breathtaking line of tall, narrow wooden warehouses, all with sharply peaked gables facing the harbor, stood shoulder to shoulder, creating a formidable front against the sea. These buildings were not just storage, they were a complete ecosystem. The ground floors were dark, cavernous spaces where the pungent, salty smell of thousands upon thousands of drying fish hung permanently in the air. The upper floors housed the merchants and their apprentices, all living and working in a space that was part office, part fortress, and part home. The entire operation was governed by a brutal, unyielding seasonal rhythm. Each summer, a fleet of Hanseatic cogs would arrive from German ports, carrying grain, malt, and cloth from the south. They would anchor in the harbor, and their crews would work frantically throughout the short summer months, loading the ships with the previous year's catch of stockfish, which had been stockpiled all winter. The trade was a meticulously calculated exchange, with the price of grain set against the price of fish in a DELICATE Chinese letter that the Hanseatic merchants controlled completely. Life for the young German men who ran the brigand was one of stark hierarchy and rigid discipline. They were divided into two distinct groups, the journeymen and the apprentices. The journeymen, older and more experienced, held the positions of authority. They managed the accounts, negotiated with Norwegian suppliers, and enjoyed a degree of freedom. The apprentices, often boys in their early teens sent from Germany, lived a life of near servitude. They were the ones who handled the heavy, reeking fish, stacked them in the warehouses, and performed all the manual labor, all while living in cramped quarters under the strict watch of their masters. They were forbidden from interacting with the local Norwegian population, a rule enforced to protect the League's business practices and maintain their monopoly. And what a monopoly it was! The demand for this dried cod was astronomical, driven by the powerful dictates of the Catholic Church. Throughout Europe, meat was forbidden on Fridays and throughout the entire 40 days of Lent. But fish was permitted. Stockfish, which could be stored for years without spoiling, became the perfect protein for millions of faithful Catholics. From the bustling markets of Paris to the quiet monasteries of the German countryside, this fish from the far north fed a continent. The Hanseatic League did not just control the supply. They controlled the very calendar of hunger and devotion, turning a simple preserved fish into a river of silver that flowed directly into their coffers, financing their growing dominance over the northern seas. Yet the silver from Bergen and the furs from Novgorod were only two currents in a much larger river of wealth. That river flowed south to a city that was the glittering commercial heart of all Europe, Bruges. Here, in the heart of the Low Countries, the Hanseatic League established its fourth and most sophisticated contour. Unlike the fortified isolation of the Peterhof or the fish-scented wharves of Bergen, the Hanseatic presence in Bruges was woven directly into the city's vibrant, cosmopolitan fabric. Their compound was a hub of finance and diplomacy, a place where deals were struck not just for goods, but for the very future of trade. And the centerpiece of all this activity was a single, transformative product, Flemish cloth. This was not the rough, homespun wool of a peasant's tunic. This was a luxury item, a fabric so finely woven, so brilliantly dyed in rich scarlets and deep blues, that it was coveted by nobles and bishops from London to Constantinople. It was the perfect commodity for a long-distance trading network, incredibly valuable for its weight. A single cog could carry a fortune in rolled bolts of cloth, a cargo far more profitable than bulky grain or heavy timber. The genius of the Hanseatic League was that they inserted themselves at both ends of this premier industry. From their contour at the London Steel Yard, they controlled the export of high-quality English wool, the essential raw material for the Flemish weavers. Then their ships carried that raw wool to Bruges, and after the skilled artisans had worked their magic, those same ships transported the finished, luxurious cloth back out to their trading posts in Novgorod, Bergen, and beyond. They became the indispensable middlemen, controlling the supply chain from the sheep on the English hills to the nobleman's cloak in a Russian court. This position gave them a weapon far more powerful than any sword, the trade embargo. When the city fathers of Bruges passed laws that the Hanse considered unfair, or when local officials seized their goods, the League did not plead or protest. They acted. They would announce a Verlegung, a complete cessation of all trade. The Hanseatic merchants would pack their ledgers, lock their warehouses, and simply leave the city. The effect was catastrophic. Without English wool, the looms of Flanders fell silent. Without Hanseatic ships to distribute their cloth, the economy of Bruges ground to a halt. The city's wealth, so dependent on this continuous flow, would begin to wither. It was a stark demonstration of collective power, a silent economic siege that brought proud cities to their knees without a single drop of blood being shed. The League proved that in the new world of commerce, the most powerful force was not a king's army, but a merchant's calculated decision to simply walk away. This network of commercial fortresses, from London to Novgorod, could not have functioned on handshakes alone. The true strength of the Hanseatic League lay not in its walls, but in its words. It was an empire of paper and promise, a sprawling entity with no single ruler, no official borders, and no standing army. Its binding force was a shared legal framework, a system of governance that evolved from simple verbal agreements into something far more powerful. In the beginning, mutual interest was enough. A merchant from Lübeck and a merchant from Hamburg, meeting on a foreign dock, would agree to watch each other's backs, to share information about pirate threats or dishonest local officials. These informal pacts were the first threads of the network, but as the League grew to encompass nearly 200 towns and cities, this ad hoc system became untenable. How could a decision made in Cologne be enforced in the far-off outpost of Tallinn? The answer was the Hanseatic, the Hanseatic Diet. This was the League's parliament, a gathering of representatives from the member cities that would meet, though irregularly, in Lübeck. Picture the scene in the city's Grand Council chamber. Delegates from bustling ports like Danzig and Bremen would sit alongside envoys from smaller towns, all debating the critical issues of the day. Should they declare a trade embargo against a troublesome king? How should they respond to the rising threat of pirates in the North Sea? These were not mere discussions. They were negotiations that would shape the fate of Northern Europe. The most crucial product of these meetings was the recess. This was not a break or a pause. It was the written record of all decisions made, a formal legal document that was then copied and sent by courier to every member city. The recess was the law of the land, or rather, the law of the sea. It standardized everything from the interest rates that could be charged on loans to the procedures for settling disputes between merchants from different cities. If a Hanseatic town violated a rule set out in a recess, it risked expulsion from the League, a death sentence for a city whose prosperity depended on its trade connections. This was a revolutionary form of decentralized power. No single city, not even Lübeck, could dictate terms to the others. Every major decision required consensus. It was a slow and often messy process, but it created a profound sense of collective ownership and responsibility. The League was not ruled by a king, but by a covenant of commerce, written down in the clear, uncompromising language of the recess, and agreed upon by a fellowship of free cities. These legal agreements and economic blockades were only as strong as the ships that carried them across the sea. The true workhorse of the Hanseatic League was the cog, a vessel whose unique design was perfectly suited to the demands of northern trade. It was a floating fortress of commerce, instantly recognizable by its high, straight sides and a single, massive square sail. Unlike the sleek Viking longships that came before it, the cog was built for capacity, not for speed. Its most ingenious feature was a flat bottom, allowing it to settle comfortably on the mud of a shallow tidal harbor or beach itself to load and unload cargo without a deep water dock. This was the perfect solution for the Baltic, a sea famed for its countless sandbars and dangerously shifting coastlines. A cog could venture where other ships dared not, carrying immense volumes of bulk goods. Its cavernous hull could be filled with hundreds of barrels of salted herring, stacks of timber, or bales of wool, turning the northern seas into a liquid highway for the League's wealth. But mastering the ship was only half the battle. Navigating these treacherous waters was an art form in an age without accurate charts or compasses. How did a captain find his way from Lübeck to Bergen through fog, storm, and the long, dark winters. He relied on a suite of simple, yet profoundly effective, tools and a lifetime of accumulated wisdom. The most vital instrument was the lead line, a simple weighted rope marked at intervals. A sailor would stand at the ship's bow, swing the lead, and cast it forward into the water, calling out the depth as the line went taut. More than just a measurement, the lead line also had a hollow in its base that could be filled with tallow. When it hit the seabed, it would bring up a sample of sand, mud, or gravel. An experienced captain could taste the sediment or feel its texture and know exactly where he was, as surely as if he were reading a modern map. These depths and bottom types were meticulously recorded in handwritten books known as rudders, the secret encyclopedias of the sea. A rudder was not a map with lines, but a verbal narrative of a journey. It would describe a voyage in terms of landmarks, sailing directions, and the all-important soundings. It might read, from the Red Cliff, sail north by the east until the water deepens to 20 fathoms, then turn west-northwest until you find a bottom of white sand. This knowledge was a captain's most prized possession, passed from master to apprentice over generations. It was a living library of the sea, ensuring that even in the absence of technology, the League's ships could find their way, binding the scattered ports together with nothing more than a knotted rope and the courage to sail into the unknown. The Grand Council chamber in Lubeck was a crucible of competing ambitions. Here, in a room thick with the scent of wax and old timber, delegates from over 70 cities gathered for a Hanseatic, the League's great diet. It was a spectacle of raw, decentralized power. The richest cities, Lübeck, Hamburg, Cologne, and Danzig, held the loudest voices, but even a small port like Rostock could demand to be heard. There was no king to issue commands, no single army to enforce a decree. Every critical decision, from declaring a trade embargo to negotiating peace with a hostile king, had to be forged through painful, protracted debate. Imagine the challenge of aligning the interests of a city, focused on Baltic grain, with one whose wealth came from North Sea herring, or a metal working town in the German interior, with an outpost on the Russian frontier. Their priorities were often a world apart. Reaching a consensus was a monumental task, a slow dance of persuasion, threat, and compromise. A single city's stubborn refusal could derail a plan for months. The ultimate product of this exhausting process was the recess, the official document that recorded every agreement. This was not a suggestion, it was the law. A copy would be dispatched by courier to every member city, from Bruges to Reval, and its terms were binding. To violate a recess was to risk Hanse, exclusion from the League itself, a punishment that meant commercial isolation and economic ruin. This was the ultimate test of Hanseatic unity. Could a loose fellowship of merchants, each fiercely protective of their own profits, truly act as one? The very survival of their entire commercial empire depended on the answer forged in that room. The consensus forged in Lübeck's council chamber meant nothing if a merchant's ship never reached its destination. For all their legal agreements and economic might, the Hanseatic League faced a threat that could not be negotiated with: the pirates who infested the Baltic and North Seas. The most notorious of these sea rovers were the Victual Brothers, a brotherhood in name only. They began as privateers, legally sanctioned by a Swedish king to disrupt his Danish enemies during a royal feud. But when the war ended, the Victual Brothers did not disband. They had tasted the riches of plunder and founded their own pirate republic on the island of Gotland, turning the League's vital Middle Sea into a hunting ground. Their fleets grew to include dozens of ships and hundreds of men, a floating outlaw state that preyed mercilessly on Hanseatic commerce. They did not just steal cargo, they captured entire fleets of grain ships, seized fortified ports, and held wealthy merchants for ransom. The League's lifeblood was being cut off at sea. Faced with this existential crisis, the merchant cities had to make a terrible choice. They were traders, not warriors. Their treasuries were filled with silver, not allocated for warships, but the Victual Brothers left them no alternative. In a monumental display of collective action, the Hanseatic cities pooled their resources, bypassing their slow, consensus-based government for swift, decisive action. They financed a series of ad hoc war fleets, commissioning their sturdy cogs to be retrofitted with wooden fighting castles at the bow and stern, turning cargo carriers into platforms for archers and men-at-arms. These were not royal navies, they were militias of the sea, funded by merchant guilds and crewed by sailors who knew the waters as well as the pirates themselves. In a prolonged and brutal campaign, this Hanseatic fleet finally cornered and destroyed the Victual Brothers, breaking their power and reclaiming the sea lanes. This victory over piracy was a turning point. It forced the League to confront a stark new reality. Their wealth made them a target, and their scattered cities were indefensible without command of the water. They could no longer afford to be merely a trading network. To survive, they had to become a naval power. The successful hunt for the Victual Brothers proved that when they united their fleets, they could project force across the northern seas, a force that could challenge not just outlaws, but kings. This hard-won lesson in maritime supremacy would soon be tested against a far more organized and dangerous foe, one who saw the Hanseatic League not as a nuisance of pirates, but as a rival to be crushed. The victory over the Victual Brothers had proven the League could fight, but a far greater predator now watched from the Danish throne. King Valdemar IV was a monarch of ruthless ambition, and he saw the Hanseatic League not as a partner, but as a parasite sapping the wealth and sovereignty from his kingdom. He understood that their power flowed not from castles, but from markets, and he moved to seize the source. With a swift military campaign, he captured the rich coastal towns of Skanör and Falsterbo, the very heart of the Scandinavian herring trade. This was no simple pirate raid. This was a king deliberately striking at the economic engine of the Hanse, controlling the flow of the silver-scaled fish that fed millions and financed their entire operation. For the merchant cities, this was an existential crisis. The Danish Sound was the narrow gateway between the Baltic and North Seas, the choke point for all their commerce. If Valdemar controlled the herring and the Sound, he could strangle their trade at will. The usual tools of embargo and negotiation were useless against a king who held the territory by force. The League faced a stark choice: submit to Danish domination or go to war against a unified kingdom. In 1367, the impossible happened. The often squabbling Hanseatic cities, setting aside their individual interests, formed the Confederation of Cologne. This was a formal military alliance, a pact that committed their collective resources to a single, audacious goal: breaking the power of Denmark. They assembled a war fleet unlike any seen before in the Baltic, a Confederate armada of cogs retrofitted for battle. They sailed not as the merchants of Lübeck or Hamburg, but as the United Hanse. In 1368, this fleet met the Danish navy in a decisive confrontation. The details of the battle are lost to time, but its outcome is not. The Hanseatic Confederation achieved a stunning naval victory, shattering King Valdemar's forces and effectively blockading his kingdom. The traders had become conquerors of the sea. With his navy destroyed and his coasts under siege, Valdemar was forced to the negotiating table. The resulting Treaty of Stralsund in 1370 was not merely a peace agreement, it was the ultimate testament to Hanseatic power. The League secured the reopening of the herring markets and their trade privileges, but they extracted a concession that echoed through the halls of every monarchy in Europe. The treaty granted the Hanseatic League the right to veto the succession of the Danish throne. No future king could ascend without the approval of the merchant cities. For a loose federation with no king and no standing army to hold such power over a crowned monarch was unprecedented. It marked the absolute peak of their political influence, a moment when commerce did not just influence geopolitics, it dictated its terms. The humble cog had not only carried goods across the sea, it had carried the League to a position where they could crown kings. A young man from Bremen, perhaps only 16 years old, would have stepped into the contour at Bergen and entered a world of rigid, almost monastic discipline. His home was not a city street, but a long, dark wooden gallery within the brigand compound, a narrow corridor of commerce where the air was permanently chilled and thick with the smell of salt and drying fish. His day began and ended by the sound of a bell, signaling the locking of the heavy gates that separated the German enclave from the Norwegian city outside. This separation was absolute. He was forbidden from learning the local language beyond the barest necessities of trade. He could not share a meal with a Norwegian, attend a local church service, or, most critically, form any romantic attachment. A merchant who married a local woman was instantly and permanently cast out from the Hanseatic community, his trading privileges revoked forever. This was not a life of exploration and cultural exchange. It was a life of calculated isolation, all designed to protect the League's most valuable asset, its business practices. The heart of this existence was the ledger book. In the dim light of a tallow candle, our young apprentice would spend hours meticulously recording every transaction. Surviving account books from the contours are masterpieces of obsessive detail. They list every last barrel of rye, every bundle of furs, every single herring, their values calculated in a dizzying array of currencies. One letter from a merchant in Bruges to his partner in Lubeck survives, a dry document filled with prices and shipping schedules, but it ends with a sudden, heartbreakingly human plea. He writes, "I have not seen my family in 7 years. Send word of my children." The immense profitability of this life came at a profound personal cost. These men lived in a state of suspended animation, their youth spent in a foreign compound, their only connection to home the infrequent letters that traveled with the summer supply ships. They amassed small fortunes through sheer discipline, their entire social world confined to the other German men within the contour's walls, bound together by shared rules and a shared purpose. They were the human cogs in a vast commercial machine, their personal sacrifices fueling an empire that stretched across the known world. What kind of society could create such a system, and what happened when that system began to crack from within? The power of the Hanseatic League was not measured in royal decrees or conquered acres, but in the scent of a burning candle and the texture of a nobleman's cloak. Imagine walking through a European marketplace in the 14th century. Every stall told a story of a northern commercial empire. Your hand might brush against a bolt of Flemish cloth, a fabric so dense and finely woven it felt like liquid, dyed in impossible shades of crimson and sapphire using rare pigments that only the Hanseatic network could reliably supply. This was the ultimate luxury good, a silent signal of status that traveled from the skilled weavers of Bruges to the courts of Novgorod, all in the hold of a Hanseatic cog. In the churches that formed the heart of every town, the very light was Hanseatic. The candles flickering before the altars were made from Russian beeswax, prized because it burned clean and sweet, without the smoky, acrid smell of tallow. The scent of that pure honeyed wax, rising in countless cathedrals, was the scent of a Hanseatic monopoly, a spiritual commodity as valuable as any metal. And on the fingers of the devout, one might find a rosary of Baltic amber, its beads warm to the touch, capturing the ancient light of a long-vanished forest. Hanseatic merchants controlled the flow of this golden resin from the shores of Prussia, where it washed up like sea gold, to the workshops where artisans carved it into objects of devotion and beauty. But the League's reach extended far beyond luxury. It was rooted in the most basic human need, the need to eat. In the coastal towns of Scandinavia, the autumn air grew thick with the smell of wood smoke and fish. This was the sound and scent of the herring harvest, a seasonal frenzy where millions of silver fish were caught, gutted, and packed into barrels with a vital ingredient, salt from the mines of Lüneburg. This salt was the League's white gold. Without it, food would spoil, and the great herring fisheries that fed millions on fish days would be impossible. The Hanseatic League did not just transport this salt, they controlled its source and its distribution, making them the masters of preservation itself. Then there was the stockfish from Bergen. This was not a fresh meal, but a culinary paradox, a food that had to be beaten with a hammer before it could be boiled into an edible state. Its taste was a concentrated essence of the sea, salty, leathery, and profoundly nourishing. For the millions of Europeans observing the many meatless days mandated by the Church, this hardened fish was a dietary staple. The Hanseatic League's control over its production and distribution meant they held the key to the protein supply for a vast portion of the continent. From the luxurious to the essential, the goods that filled the medieval world, the very fabric of daily life, were threaded together by the invisible hand of a merchant alliance that understood one fundamental truth. True power lies not in controlling land, but in controlling what people need, desire, and believe in. A merchant in Lubeck could sell a shipment of timber to a partner in Bruges without a single coin ever changing hands across the water. The entire edifice of Hanseatic commerce was built not on gold, but on a fragile, invisible foundation of trust. In a world without banks, credit scores, or wire transfers, your word and your family's reputation were your only collateral. Business was a deeply personal affair, conducted along networks of kinship and long-standing relationships. A father in Cologne would send his son to apprentice in the Riga contour, not just to learn the trade, but to embed him within a web of trusted contacts. These young men were the living fibers that connected the network, their loyalty ensuring that a deal made in one city would be honored in another, months later and hundreds of miles away. The primary instrument that made this possible was the letter of exchange. Think of it as a sophisticated and legally binding IOU. A merchant in Novgorod, for example, could purchase a load of furs and issue a letter of exchange to the seller. This document instructed his business partner in London to pay the equivalent value from his own funds to the fur trader's agent on a specific future date, often tied to the arrival of a ship. This simple piece of paper was a revolution. It allowed vast sums of value to move across Europe without the immense risk and hassle of shipping chests of silver, which were heavy, vulnerable to pirates, and subject to the whims of every local lord demanding a minting fee. The system, however, hinged entirely on the certainty that the man in London would honor the debt. A single default could shatter a reputation built over generations, cutting a merchant off from the entire network. This trust was periodically tested and solidified at the great annual fairs, like those in the Champagne region of France. These were not merely markets, they were the financial heartbeat of medieval Europe. Here, once a year, merchants from across the continent would converge. It was a grand settling of accounts, a moment when the complex web of promises and letters of exchange woven over the previous 12 months were finally untangled. Debts were paid, balances were cleared, and new lines of credit were established for the coming year's ventures. The rhythmic pulse of these fairs gave the Hanseatic League its financial tempo, creating a predictable cycle of obligation and settlement that allowed their commercial empire to breathe and expand. This elegant system of trust and paper allowed a merchant in a Baltic port to fund a venture in the North Sea, binding the scattered cities not with chains of iron, but with unbreakable threads of mutual financial interest. The vast fortunes amassed from furs, fish, and cloth demanded a permanent voice, one that could not be sunk by storms or silenced by kings. This voice was spoken in brick and mortar. Across the flat plains of northern Europe, where building stone was scarce, the Hanseatic cities sponsored an architectural revolution, a style so distinctive it became their signature, brick Gothic. They transformed the humble clay of the riverbeds into something monumental, baking the earth itself into a statement of power. The red and black glazed bricks rose in intricate patterns, forming facades that were not merely walls, but woven tapestries of commerce and faith. In Lubeck, the heart of the League, they built St. Mary's Church, a cathedral of trade that dwarfed every other structure in the city. Its twin spires pierced the low-hanging northern sky, a landmark visible for miles to every approaching ship. Inside, the vaulted ceiling soared to a breathtaking height, creating a cavernous space that seemed to swallow sound itself. This was not just a place for prayer. It was a deliberate display of civic pride and immense wealth, funded entirely by the city's merchants as a declaration of their independence from the local bishop. The message was chiseled into every arch: we answer to God and our own ledgers, not to a prince. The same ambition shaped their secular power. Town halls across the Hanseatic world were designed to intimidate and impress. They often combined the functions of government, court, and guildhall into one magnificent complex, their facades adorned with ornate gables and towering spires that rivaled the churches. And guarding the entrance to these wealthy urban republics were colossal city gates like the Holstentor in Lubeck. With its formidable round towers and thick walls, it was not a military fortress in a traditional sense. Its primary function was symbolic, a massive, unmovable billboard announcing to every traveler and trader, "You are now entering a city of the Hanseatic League." Here, commerce is protected, contracts are honored, and the law is Lubeck law. These buildings were a unified corporate identity, cast in fired clay. A merchant sailing from Riga to Bruges would see the same architectural language repeated in each port, a familiar and reassuring sight. It told him he was home, within the network, a citizen of a vast, invisible empire whose true capital was not a palace, but a harbor, and whose crown jewels were the warehouses lining its quays. But the very consensus that forged their power became its greatest vulnerability. Within the Grand Council chamber in Lübeck, the facade of unity began to fracture under the weight of individual ambition. The city of Cologne, a powerhouse in its own right, grew restless. Its merchants looked west, towards England, and saw a future that did not align with the League's collective strategy. When the Hanseatic Diet imposed a trade embargo against England to gain political leverage, Cologne openly defied the decision. Its merchants continued their lucrative trade with London, prioritizing their own immediate profits over the League's long-term goals. This was not a minor act of disobedience, it was a direct challenge to the core Hanseatic principle of collective action. The recess, that binding legal document, was being torn apart by one of the League's own founding members. Cologne's rebellion revealed a fatal flaw in the Hanseatic model. A confederation of independent cities could only function as long as every city believed that unity was more valuable than going it alone. As the 15th century dawned, that belief was crumbling from within. Just as internal loyalty wavered, an external storm gathered to the west. The merchants of the Low Countries, particularly the Dutch, were no longer content to be mere customers of the Hanse. They had studied the League's methods and improved upon them. Dutch shipbuilders developed a new vessel, the Flight. This was a revolution in maritime design, a ship built with a vast, bulbous hull for maximum cargo space, a simple rigging that required a smaller crew, and a shallow draft that allowed it to navigate rivers and coastal waters with unparalleled efficiency. A Dutch flight could transport goods at a fraction of the cost of a Hanseatic cog. This was not just competition, it was economic obsolescence. The Dutch fleet, growing by the year, began to bypass the traditional Hanseatic choke points. They sailed directly into the Baltic, offering better prices for grain and timber, and they ventured out into the Atlantic, opening direct trade routes for spices and other luxuries that the landlocked Hanseatic network could not easily access. The League's Baltic monopoly, once an unassailable fortress, was being besieged on two fronts, by the defiant independence of Cologne from within, and by the relentless, efficient competition of the Dutch from without. The golden age of Hanseatic dominance was over, and a brutal struggle for the soul of northern trade had begun. The world was suddenly growing larger, and the Hanseatic League was left behind in its northern corner. For centuries, their power had been built on controlling the choke points of the Baltic and North Seas, but now European ships were sailing past their gates. The age of discovery flung open a new global stage, and the main actors were no longer the city-states of Germany, but the great monarchies of Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands. These nations poured their royal treasuries into voyages that bypassed the old overland spice routes and the Hanseatic middlemen entirely. Why pay a premium for Eastern goods that had been hauled across Russia and the Baltic when a Portuguese caravel could sail directly to the source around Africa? The center of economic gravity in Europe shifted decisively from the enclosed Baltic to the open Atlantic, leaving the Hanseatic network on the periphery of a new world economy. This slow, geographical obsolescence was then brutally accelerated by war. The 30 Years' War, a conflict of terrifying religious and political ferocity, raged across the German heartlands from 1618 to 1648. The very towns that formed the backbone of the Hanseatic League became battlefields. Marauding armies stripped the countryside bare, besieged and sacked prosperous cities, and decimated the population. Trade routes were severed, warehouses were looted, and the complex web of trust and credit that had fueled Hanseatic commerce for generations was torn to shreds. The League's economic foundation was not merely weakened, it was systematically dismantled. In the wake of this chaos, a new political order emerged, one that had no patience for the League's ancient privileges. Powerful, centralized states like Sweden and a resurgent England now viewed the Hanseatic enclaves within their borders not as economic assets, but as affronts to their sovereignty. One by one, they revoked the special trading rights that had been the lifeblood of the contours. The Steelyard in London, once an untouchable state within a state, was finally shut down by Queen Elizabeth I, its tax exemptions and privileges stripped away. The Hanseatic League, which had once dictated terms to kings, now had no answer to the canons and edicts of the nation-state. Its greatest weakness, however, was not external, but internal. The League's structure was frozen in time, bound by the conservative traditions of its merchant guilds. These guilds enforced production limits to keep prices high and resisted technological innovation to protect the jobs of their members. This rigid, guild-based model was utterly incapable of competing with the new, fluid capitalism of the Dutch and English. Their rivals operated through joint stock companies, pooling massive amounts of capital from thousands of investors to fund risky, but immensely profitable, global ventures. The Hanseatic merchant, working with his family's limited funds and a network of personal trust, was like a master craftsman trying to compete with a factory. The world had changed its rules, and the Hanseatic League, once the architect of the commercial order, could only watch as its own design was dismantled, piece, by forces it could no longer control. By the mid-1600s, the Grand Council chamber in Lubeck often echoed with more silence than debate. Where once dozens of delegates from cities like Cologne and Danzig had fiercely debated the fate of kingdoms, now there were only empty chairs. The Hanseatic, the very parliament of this merchant empire, was dying of neglect. The Confederation of Cologne had been its last great act of unity, and in the centuries that followed, the threads of that unity unraveled one by one. Cities preoccupied with their own survival saw little reason to send expensive delegations to argue over policies that no longer held sway over the wider world. The League was becoming a ghost, its body still present, but its spirit long departed. Then, in 1669, the final, formal Hanseatic was convened. It was a gathering not of power, but of memory. Only 9 cities bothered to send representatives. They met in a room that had once thrummed with the energy of a continent, and they did not even bother to produce a recess, a formal record of decisions. There was nothing left to decide. The meeting was a quiet acknowledgement of a truth everyone already knew. The alliance that had defied kings and commanded the seas was now a legal fiction, a name without substance. Yet, the name itself possessed a strange, stubborn longevity. The Hanseatic League was formally dissolved not in the 17th century, but in 1862, by a decree from Emperor Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire. This was not the dramatic fall of an empire, but the bureaucratic erasure of a corpse. For nearly 200 years after its last meaningful meeting, the League had existed only on paper, a phantom limb of European commerce that a bureaucrat's pen finally acknowledged was gone. Its long, quiet fade into obscurity stands as a poignant final chapter. An empire built not on conquest, but on contracts and trust, does not shatter in a single cataclysm. It simply ceases to be believed in, until one day, no one remains who remembers how to say its name. There is no single vault holding the secrets of the Hanseatic League. The very heart of this commercial empire is a ghost, a missing archive that has never been found. For an organization that documented every transaction with obsessive precision, the absence of a central library of its records is the ultimate historical paradox. Why does no such trove exist? The answer lies in the League's deepest strength, which became its greatest historical curse, its radical decentralization. This was not a kingdom with a capital city and a royal chancery. It was a sprawling network of independent cities, each guarding its own ledgers, its own copies of the recessed documents, and its own correspondence. The true archive of the Hanseatic League is scattered across 100 cities, from London to Tallinn, a million fragments waiting to be pieced together like an endless, daunting puzzle. This is why our understanding of the League is constantly evolving, reshaped not by the discovery of a single lost library, but by the slow, patient work of archaeologists. A dredge in a Baltic harbor might pull up a piece of waterlogged timber that turns out to be the hull of a Hanseatic cog, its very shape telling us more about their shipbuilding than any written manual. Excavations in the mud of a modern city, like the foundations of the London Steel Yard or the Brigham Wharf in Bergen, reveal the daily trash of these merchant compounds, the broken pottery, lost coins, and discarded tools that speak of their lives with an honesty paper never could. Each new shipwreck is a time capsule, its cargo of barrel staves and ballast stones mapping a forgotten trade route. Every time a cellar is dug in a former Hanseatic town, there is a chance to find a sealed refuse pit filled with the leavings of a 15th century merchant's household. These silent, physical testimonies are now the primary witnesses, forcing us to constantly revise our picture of their world. The written records give us the laws and the prices, but it is the silent archaeology that is beginning to whisper the human story behind the ink. The language of the counting house and the ship's manifest was not Latin, but Middle Low German. From the bustling Thames to the distant Volkhov, this became the indispensable tongue of balance sheets and bills of lading, a linguistic common ground that turned a Brabantine merchant and a Livonian trader into partners. When a captain from Bremen negotiated the price of timber in Riga, he did so in the same practical German dialect used by a scribe recording a debt in Bruges. This shared commercial language streamlined every transaction, but the true foundation of their unity was written in a different code entirely, the enduring power of Lubeck law. Adopting this legal framework was a conscious choice for a city, a declaration that it was joining a system where justice was predictable and commerce was protected. A merchant sailing from a town that followed Lubeck law to another that did the same could conduct his business with absolute confidence. The measures for a bushel of grain would be identical. The procedures for registering a property sale or resolving a contract dispute would be familiar. This created a powerful legal identity that transcended local dialects and loyalties, making a citizen of Danzig and a citizen of Hamburg citizens of the same invisible republic. Beyond the courtroom and the ledger, a shared culture of Hanseatic honor cemented these bonds. This was an unwritten code, more powerful than any statute. Your word was your bond, and your reputation was your most valuable asset. A merchant known for sharp practice or defaulting on a debt would find himself frozen out of the network, his name blacklisted in contours across the continent. This culture manifested in shared social and religious life. In foreign ports, Hanseatic merchants attended their own German-speaking churches, like St. Peter's in Novgorod, celebrating the same feast days and observances. They lived by similar guild regulations, participated in the same drinking rituals in their guild halls, and adhered to a collective mindset that prioritized the network's well-being over short-term individual gain. This was the cultural glue, a potent mixture of shared language, standardized law, and a fierce, unwritten code of honor that transformed a loose alliance of competitive cities into a cohesive community, capable of speaking with one voice to the crowned heads of Europe. The spirit of the Hanseatic League never truly vanished from the map of Europe. Its legacy echoes in the most ambitious peace project of the modern age, the European Union. Just as the medieval League created a framework for trade and legal cooperation between fiercely independent cities, the European Union seeks to bind nations together through shared economic and political structures. Both were born from a hard-won understanding that prosperity and stability are best achieved through partnership, not perpetual conflict. The Hanseatic cities abolished arbitrary tolls and standardized weights to create a common market, a direct precursor to the U.S. single market that allows goods, capital, and people to move freely across borders. They spoke with one voice in foreign lands through their contours, much as the EU negotiates trade deals as a single bloc on the world stage. This is not to say the League was a proto-European Union, but rather that it represents a deep-seated, centuries-old impulse in this part of the world, a recognition that unity is the surest path to strength. On a more local level, the League's name and memory have been actively revived. In 1980, a group of former Hanseatic cities founded a new Hanseatic League, a modern network focused not on monopolies, but on tourism, cultural exchange, and shared historical preservation. Today, over 180 towns across Europe participate in an annual Hanseatic Days festival, a vibrant celebration that transforms city centers with medieval markets, music, and crafts. rekindling the cultural bonds of a bygone commercial empire. Perhaps the most enduring legacy, however, is etched into the identity of cities like Hamburg and Bremen. In these great port cities, you can still feel a distinct Hanseatic pride, a civic self-confidence rooted in their history as free, self-governing merchant republics. Their coats of arms still bear the word Free Hanseatic City, a constitutional title that speaks to a deep-seated tradition of independence, pragmatism, and a global outlook. The wealth that built their magnificent town halls and charitable foundations came not from landed aristocracy, but from trade, fostering a culture of civic responsibility and open-mindedness that persists to this day. The cogs are gone, but the mindset they fostered, one of connection and cooperation across water and time, continues to shape the soul of Northern Europe. The silent artifacts pulled from the mud are now finding their voice through lines of code and stunning visual simulations. Digital humanities are breathing life back into the Hanseatic world, transforming ledgers and ship timbers into an interactive landscape we can finally navigate. Historians and data scientists are collaborating to build precise three-dimensional models of the great contours. You can now don a virtual reality headset and walk through the London steel yard as it stood in its prime, hearing the creak of cranes and seeing the very barrels of Rhenish wine being unloaded on the Thames wharf. This is more than a reconstruction. It is a digital time machine that allows us to test historical theories. How many men could fit in the brigands' cramped dormitories? How long would it take to fill a cog with salt? These virtual models provide answers grounded in architectural reality. Beyond the buildings, geographic information system mapping is revolutionizing our understanding of their trade routes. By inputting thousands of data points from port records, cargo manifests, and rudders, researchers can generate dynamic maps that show the ebb and flow of commerce across the centuries. We can watch a time-lapse visualization of the Baltic Sea, where shimmering lines of light represent the seasonal voyages of the grain fleets from Danzig or the herring ships from Skanör. This reveals patterns invisible to the naked eye, the precise choke points of their economy, the seasonal bottlenecks, and the devastating impact of a single pirate raid on the entire network. The true power lies in big data analysis. By digitizing and cross-referencing thousands of pages of cargo manifests and customs accounts, algorithms can detect subtle correlations a human reader would miss. They can trace how a bad harvest in Prussia affected the price of cloth in Bruges 6 months later, or how a political crisis in England shifted the flow of silver into Novgorod. This complex systems analysis shows the Hanseatic League not as a static entity, but as a living, breathing, and deeply vulnerable economic organism. The ghost of the Hanse is being resurrected not in a single archive, but in a vast digital twin, allowing us to witness, for the first time, the breathtaking scale and intricate clockwork of the machine that bound Northern Europe together for 400 years. For 400 years, the Hanseatic League proved that an idea could be more powerful than an army. This was a commercial republic that never crowned a king, drew a border, or raised a standing army, yet it commanded fleets, dictated royal succession, and forged a common identity across 1,000 miles of coastline. Its power was not etched into stone on conquered battlefields, but written in the ink of contracts and the shared trust between partners. The League's true legacy is not a list of battles won, but a set of revolutionary principles that would shape the modern world. It championed the idea of free trade long before the term existed, working to abolish the arbitrary tolls that strangled commerce. It pioneered a form of international law through its binding recess documents, creating a predictable legal space where deals made in one city would be honored in another. And it was a bold experiment in urban autonomy, proving that cities, not just kings, could be sovereign actors on the world stage, governing themselves through merchant councils and their own legal codes. In the end, the story of the Hanse is the story of connection itself. In our own era of instant communication and global supply chains, the tale of a network that bound a continent through trust, cooperation, and a shared ambition feels less like a distant history and more like a profound and timeless lesson. The story of the Hanseatic League is a legacy you can still walk through today, if you know where to look. To stand on the cobblestones of Lübeck's Old Town, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, is to stand in the very heart of this merchant empire. For a truly immersive experience, the European Hansa Museum in Lübeck is essential. It traces the entire epic journey, from those first tentative trade agreements to the League's final, quiet fade. If you cannot make the journey, several compelling documentaries bring their world to life, exploring the sunken cogs and the bustling reconstructions of the contours. For those who prefer to read, a wealth of books delve into everything from the brutal daily life inside the Bergen Briggen to the complex economic theories behind their success. Now we would like to hear from you. What part of this 400-year saga captivates you the most? Was it their sheer economic power, the ability to crown kings without an army? Or perhaps the political genius of a network that defied the very idea of a nation-state? Maybe it is the enduring mystery of the missing Central Archive, a ghost that still haunts historians. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to continue this conversation with you. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of history's greatest commercial mysteries. If you enjoyed uncovering the secrets of the Hansa, consider subscribing for more explorations into the forgotten empires and enigmatic stories that shaped our world.